His decapitated head and severed hands, blackened with blood, were hammered into the rostra, where he had once stood tall as the Republic's greatest defender. The crowd that gathered was struck by horror. This grotesque display was more than execution. It was ritual humiliation. Every nail hammered into wood was a reminder of Antony's triumph. Every drip of blood a symbol of Cicero's defeat. After 2 years of festering rage, Mark Antony had taken his revenge, and he wanted Rome to watch as philosophy and freedom were mutilated along with their champion. So, how did Rome's most celebrated intellectual meet such a gruesome and public end? The story isn't about a single betrayal, but a war of words and wills that pushed one of Rome's most powerful men to his breaking point. This is the story of a humiliation so profound it could only be answered with butchery. This is the story of how Mark Antony waited for over a year to unleash a terrifying and symbolic revenge on his greatest rival. Our story kicks off in the chaos right after the Ides of March 44th BC. Julius Caesar, the dictator for life, was dead, stabbed 23 times by senators who called themselves the Liberators. They thought that by killing Caesar, they'd saved the Roman Republic from a tyrant. What they'd actually done was plunge it into a catastrophic power vacuum. 2 men quickly rose to the top. The first was Marcus Tullius Cicero. While he wasn't one of the assassins, Cicero was the intellectual heart of the Republican cause. He was a new man who had climbed the political ladder, not through noble birth, but through his sheer genius as a lawyer and speaker. For him, Caesar's death was a golden opportunity to restore the old republic, free from the grip of military strongmen. The other man was Mark Antony, a charismatic, battle-hardened general. Antony had been Caesar's right-hand man and his co-consul. He was a man of action, not philosophy. And he didn't see the liberators as saviors. He saw them as traitors who had murdered his friend. While Cicero had the Senate's respect, Antony had the loyalty of Caesar's soldiers and the love of the Roman people, especially after his masterful, fiery speech at Caesar's funeral turned the public against the assassins, forcing them to flee Rome. For a few tense months, a fragile peace held. Antony surprisingly tried to play nice, even backing a law to abolish the office of dictator forever. It looked like he and the Senate, led by Cicero, might just find a way to work together. But this was just the calm before the storm. Their worldviews were fundamentally incompatible. Cicero wanted a republic ruled by law and the Senate. Antony, a product of Caesar's tutelage, believed in the power of the individual backed by an army. This uneasy truce was built on total distrust. Antony saw Cicero as a pompous, out-of-touch academic. Cicero saw Antony as an ambitious drunk, a new tyrant just waiting to take Caesar's place. Each man was everything the other despised. It was only a matter of time before one of them made a move. That move came not with a sword, but with the most powerful weapon in Cicero's arsenal, his voice. By the autumn of 44 BC, Cicero had decided that diplomacy was over. He was convinced Antony was grabbing power and twisting Caesar's legacy for his own gain. So, on September 2nd, he stood before the Senate and delivered a speech. It was the first of what would become a series of 14 brutal attacks known as the Philippics. The name itself was a historical slap in the face. It was a direct call-out to the speeches of the great Athenian orator Demosthenes, who had warned against the tyranny of Philip II of Macedon centuries before. By calling his speeches the Philippics, Cicero was casting himself as the defender of liberty and Antony as a foreign despot, an enemy at the gates. And these speeches were a masterclass in character assassination. Cicero didn't just attack Antony's politics, He tore the man himself to shreds. He painted Antony as a degenerate, a public drunk, a womanizer, and a coward. The second Philippic was so vicious that Cicero never actually delivered it in person. He just published it as a pamphlet. In it, he listed Antony's entire life as one big story of failure and corruption, accusing him of everything from massive debts to scandalous affairs, all to prove he was a threat to the Roman state. In one blistering passage, Cicero declared, "What is there in Antonius save lust, cruelty, insolence, audacity? He is wholly compact of these vices." The speeches were published and passed around Rome, spreading like wildfire. For a man like Mark Antony, whose power depended on his public image as a respected leader, this was humiliation on a whole new level. Cicero's words did real damage. They turned the Senate against Antony, successfully branding him an enemy of the state. Public opinion started to sour. Cicero, meanwhile, threw his support behind a new player, Caesar's young, ambitious adopted son, Octavian. Cicero figured he could use the boy general to crush Antony and then simply push him aside. It would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Weakened by Cicero's verbal onslaught, Antony was declared a public enemy and forced out of Rome. He marched north to take command of a province and its army, but was defeated in battle at Mutina in 43 BC. For a moment, it looked like Cicero had won. Antony was a fugitive, but the old orator had profoundly underestimated his opponent's resilience, and more importantly, his capacity for hatred. As Antony retreated over the Alps, his humiliation festered. He was just waiting for his moment, and just over a year later, he would get it. The political landscape of Rome was shifting at a dizzying pace. Cicero's plan to use Octavian backfired spectacularly. Feeling disrespected by the Senate, which denied him the honors he demanded, Octavian did the unthinkable. He marched his army on Rome, seized the treasury, and had himself declared consul. Then he reached out to his former enemy. In November of 43 BC, Octavian met with Mark Antony and another of Caesar's generals, Lepidus. On a small island in a river, the three most powerful men in Rome set aside their rivalries and formed the Second Triumvirate. This wasn't just a friendly pact. It was a legal 5-year military dictatorship, giving them the power to make laws, appoint officials, and most terrifyingly, to condemn their enemies to death without a trial. Their first order of business: settle old scores and raise some cash. They revived one of the Republic's most horrific traditions, the prescriptions. They drew up death lists and posted the names in the forum. Anyone on the list was an outlaw. Their property was seized and a huge reward was offered for their head. It was a state-sanctioned bloodbath meant to eliminate all opposition and fund their upcoming war against Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. The triumvirs callously traded the lives of their own friends and family. Lepidus sacrificed his brother. Antony agreed to the death of his uncle. And Octavian, who once admired Cicero, agreed to sacrifice the great orator. For 2 days, Octavian reportedly argued to spare Cicero, but Antony was immovable. The humiliation of the Philippics was a wound that had never healed. He didn't just want Cicero dead. He insisted his name be at the very top of the list. The man whose words had driven him from Rome and branded him a tyrant would be the first to fall. For Antony, this wasn't politics, it was personal. The hunt for Marcus Tullius Cicero was on. When the 63-year-old Cicero heard about the prescriptions, he knew it was over. He was at his villa near Tusculum and at first tried to flee. His brother Quintus, also on the list, went back to Rome for money, but was quickly caught and executed. Cicero headed south, hoping to get a ship to Macedonia. But his escape was full of indecision and despair. He was tired of running. According to the historian Plutarch, he was heard lamenting his fate, saying he would die in the country which I have often saved. He briefly boarded a ship, but rough seas made him sick, and he came ashore at his coastal villa in Formiae, seemingly resigned to what was coming. It didn't take long for the assassins to find him. The death squad was led by a centurion named Herennius and a military tribune named Popilius, a man Cicero had once successfully defended in court against a murder charge. Cicero's loyal servants wanted to fight, but he forbade it. Hearing the soldiers approach, he ordered his litter to be set down. The final moments are recorded by several historians. Cicero, frail and exhausted, leaned his head out of the litter and stroked his chin, offering his neck to his killers. Herennius then swung. It supposedly took 3 clumsy hacks to sever the old statesman's head. But Antony's orders were chillingly specific. Death wasn't enough. The instruments of his humiliation had to be destroyed. So the soldiers also chopped off both of his hands, the very hands that had written the 14 blistering speeches against him. The severed head and hands were brought back to Rome. Antony was in the forum when the soldiers arrived, holding up their gruesome trophies. The historian Appian says Antony was overjoyed, laughing and giving the assassins a massive reward. Then came the final symbolic act of vengeance. On Antony's orders, Cicero's head and hands were nailed to the rostra, the speaker's platform. This was the sacred stage of Roman oratory, the very place Cicero had defended the Republic time and again. Now his silenced head and lifeless hands were put on display, a terrifying warning to anyone else who dared to speak out. The message couldn't be clearer. The voice of the Republic was dead. The historian Cassius Dio adds one final grotesque detail. Antony's wife, Fulvia, had her own reasons to hate Cicero. He had been an enemy of her first husband, too. Dio writes that Fulvia took Cicero's severed head, spat on it, and pulled out its lifeless tongue. Then she took the pins from her hair and stabbed it over and over again. A final spiteful victory over the man whose greatest weapon had been his words. The story of Cicero and Antony is a powerful reminder of how personal feuds can literally change the world. The clash between the ultimate statesman and the ultimate soldier ended in a brutal display that signaled the death of free speech in Rome. In the short term, Antony had won, but Cicero won the war for history. Cicero's mutilated body was a symbol of Antony's power, but his words became a symbol of the Republic he died trying to save.